Hello, I'm Courtney.
Hi, I'm Dana. We're the Egg Sisters.
Today we're going to talk to you about how to make some really cool ram horns from start to finish.
This will be part one of our tutorial. It will focus on actually making the horns out of EVA foam using our Dremel rotary tools. And then we'll continue on with our next step where we actually attach it to a headdress and then add more embellishments.
So we knew we wanted 4 horns, and 2 of them would be big curly ram horns and then 2 smaller ones beneath. And we just started layering foil thicker and thicker until we got the general shape of the horn that we wanted. Once we were happy with our general foil horn shape, we layered it with masking tape to keep its shape and keep its form so it didn't get all messed up when we started putting the pattern layer on, which was a layer of plastic cling wrap. And we put the plastic cling wrap on so that when we put the next layer on, which is the duct tape, it came off easily.
With the duct tape, we continued and added maybe 2 to 3 layers, making sure we made a pretty solid coat because we will be cutting this apart and we want to make sure it's stable. So we just went around with big pieces of tape to cover the main parts, and then you may have to cut smaller pieces of tape to fit around the tips and the bends. Just make sure you have a couple layers to keep it sturdy. Once you have the horns coated with the duct tape, now it's time to draw out your cut lines of how you're going to separate the pattern. It may take a couple of attempts to refine your pattern to get it to sit exactly how you want. We cut our horns into 3 pieces, and then we drew little dashes that helps as a reference when you're trying to reassemble the parts together to know generally where the foam should meet up again. So once we were happy with our lines, we took scissors and cut off just the duct tape layer and then the cling wrap layer. Certain areas, if the curve is too complex and you can't fit your scissors in there, you can always use a knife or a box cutter, just separating the pattern from the base template. Once you have your horns templated out and cut apart, now it's time to transfer it onto foam. We used a sheet of 4mm EVA foam. First, we press down each piece with the duct tape side up to make our one side of the horns. And then to make the second set for the other side of the head, we flip the pattern over with the cling wrap facing up, so that would make an opposite side of the horns. This is just a base of our horns. We will be adding another layer on top, so if there are mistakes, it's not a big deal. They'll be covered up with the details.
Once your patterns are all traced, take a box cutter and cut them all out. Once you've gotten through cutting out all your pieces, then you can begin gluing. We used Podge rubber cement, and we actually poured it into a small bottle so that we could put a thin line on the edges, and then we took a small brush and smoothed it out. So we didn't have a really thick, chunky layer of glue on each edge. I think we did 2 to 3 layers of glue on every edge, let each one dry completely, and then we were ready to start sticking the edges together.
Once you've applied glue to all your pieces and it's completely dry, you can touch it with your fingertip and it doesn't stick to you or come off, it's just slightly tacky. Now it's time to assemble the pieces. You want to press the 2 edges that are glued firmly together until they stick, then work your way down the seam, keeping it flush as you can. Again, if it doesn't match perfectly, it's okay because this is going to be covered up with another layer of foam. Once you have the entire horn together, you can take a heat gun Apply heat evenly to the whole horn, and then using your hands you can manipulate the shape to round out the foam or stretch out areas that aren't exactly where you want it. If you want to push the curve a little bit in the horn, you can heat it up and stretch the foam. Again, foam is pretty forgiving, and then just play with it, and once it cools, it will stay in the shape that you have formed. When we made our pattern, we originally made it in 2 solid pieces. Each horn was 1 solid piece. We had an issue with the larger horn with the complex curve not coming out correctly, so we went back and re-patterned it and split it into 2 pieces so the tip was separate from the base. This allowed us to insert the end of the horn into the base, and then we could adjust exactly how much of a curve we wanted on it. Again, there is a gap between the base and the tip, but that will be covered when we do our next layer of detailing.
To give the horns a more interesting underlying structure, we purchased these 8mm half-round dowels and glued them to the seam lines of each horn. This also helped cover up any unseemly seams that may have occurred in your rough template. For the next detail layer, we cut out 1 and 2 inch strips out of 2mm foam.
Once all the strips are cut out of the 2mm foam, we applied spray adhesive. We chose spray adhesive because it's fast working and easy to use. We used 3M Foam Fast 74. We sprayed 1 layer on the back of each strip, let it dry, and we also applied a layer to the base of the horns.
The reason we created these strips and put on all this spray adhesive is for this final detail step, where we wrap the ridges or wrap the strips around each horn, creating cool organic ram horn ridges. We started with the tip using the smaller strips, the 1 inch strips, wrapping around, making the layers, and then once we got to the wider part of the horn, we changed it up to the 2 inch foam. Once your horns are completely covered with the ridges, now it's time to add the heat gun. This will soften the foam and allow you to go in with your hands and press down the foam to accentuate those ridges that we made with the dowels. And also press down any of the parts of the ridges that aren't sticking, just final detailing. Traditionally, you would run a sanding barrel left to right to sand something down, but by pulling the sanding barrel up and down, you're creating these shallow, rounded trenches to simulate the texture of the horn. With the smaller sanding barrel, we were able to get in and further refine the trenches we made with the large sanding barrel, adding more detail. By using the top edge of the tool, you can make very fine, thin marks, striations to simulate the texture of the horn. Again, working our way down in size and tools, we grabbed an engraving tool to further refine the texture of the horns. With this tool, you're able to get into the very fine spaces, kind of push the depths, add cracks or pock marks, just kind of playing with it to get even more detail. And lastly, we decided to use our cutting tool with our EZ Mandrel attachment to add some texture going
instead of vertical like we had done with the other tools, we're adding some, I guess you could call them like growth lines to kind of break up the vertical texture we already had going, and just running the tool along the grain, following the slants of the ridges we had made, just slightly score the surface, adding some more interest and detail. Once we were happy with the texture created with all the different rotary tools, it was time to heat seal.
After we were done heat sealing the horns, we hit it with about 7 layers of Plasti Dip. We like to use this, it's called a spray grip or something. We'll link it in the comments. But it just attaches to the top of your can, and it gives you a much more even, light spray. So you don't lose too much detail, and you don't get as many clumps and have some issues with your Plasti Dip. Our first coat of paint was Desert Sand by Plaid FX. It was really just a light base coat that we put on first. This lighter color is gonna help our first actual important colors show up better. After our first base coat of the Desert Sand was applied, then we started just playing around with different colors, building up different layers to try and add depth and interest to the horns. We started off with a series of different blues, again using the Plaid FX Paints and then Folk Art Paints. We chose these because they remain flexible, and so if these horns get bent, they'll just bend and not crack. After we did a couple layers of different shades of blue in the crevasses, we did what we started calling the caramel wash, but it was actually an FX paint called Grounded. It was a pretty interesting choice, but we wanted to be adventurous with these horns and play around with some different colors rather than the typical browns of like a bone or something like that.
By adding this top layer of the brown, just in a thin layer, it kind of neutralized and brought the horns together. The blue still shone through, adding that interest, but it's starting to look more like a horn. Once we got the wash of the caramel brown, now it's time to push the darks. So we took our Folk Art Paints in black and burnt umber and added some water and just kind of went in and pushed the areas that we wanted to darken, at like making the details pop a little bit more. Just going in with a smaller brush, you can just define the ridges, and if there's any like deep cracks you want to emphasize, you just go in and just push it.
Next, we took Cardinal Red and mixed it with a little bit of burnt umber. Any brown will do. It helps just bring that bright red down a little bit, make it a little more natural looking. And again, more fun with just kind of interesting color mixes. We decided to water it down and take a really stiff bristly brush. You can take a chip brush or any kind of stiff brush and trim it with some scissors to make it real spiky, or a toothbrush. And you just flick it on and make a nice spatter. We decided to spatter just the highest ridges with a little bit of red and give it kind of an interesting highlight. The next few steps, we kind of did a little back and forth dance where we're spattering more blues, spattering more browns, doing more brown, like watered down washes, going back and forth, pushing different details.
The spattering helps break up the paint that we added, but then sometimes it's a little too broken up, and then we wanted to go back and push some highlights. So we took a small brush and went back with the, what was it? The Desert Sand FX paint, and just kind of added some more details, highlighted the ridges to try and get them to pop a little more. But then we didn't like how much they were popping.
Too much.
Too much. So we went back and then spattered over that and then did a little more brown washing to bring that back down.
A way you can also break up this process is doing like the same technique but with different amounts of water in your paint. So you're gonna have higher and lower opacity colors breaking through. That gives a lot of translucency and makes things more realistic looking.
Yeah, it seems like the more layers you add, you build it up, the more realistic it looks.
Everything in life is made up of innumerable amounts of dots of color. So when you do this with spattering and breaking up the colors and layering the colors, it really is closer to reality.
Yes, it is. Indubitably. Once you're happy with the paint job and it's completely dry, it's time to seal. We decided to try these Podge spray-on sealers. It comes in gloss and matte. We decided to try out the matte finish. It just is an easy non-aerosol spray bottle, and then shake up the material, and this in light even sprays. Just do a light coat, let it dry, and then continue on each side until it's completely sealed.